Zuby is the rapper who went viral when he temporarily identified as a woman in order to break the UK women's deadlift record. He describes himself as British by birth, Nigerian by blood, Saudi Arabia raised, and an American at heart. Zuby and I spoke about many important issues, from why American men are becoming squishy and how to raise real men, to what it's like being an independent artist free of the shackles of the woke industry. This is a fun one. Zuby, I loved working with you on your Stories of Us. I think you have one of the most fascinating backgrounds I've ever heard. Will you just quickly share some of that with us again?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, thank you. So I was born in the UK. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. My family is originally Nigerian. My parents are both Igbo. And when I was in Saudi Arabia, I went to an American school up until 5th grade. So I was essentially in the American school system, kindergarten until 5th grade. When I was 11, I went to boarding school in the UK. So from the age of 11, I was traveling back and forth internationally between those two countries by myself. I was in boarding school for 7 years, did very well in school. I got into Oxford University, where I studied computer science. It's where I also started my music career. Graduated when I was 20, took a year out, did my music full time, released my second album. Then I moved to London. I actually worked in the corporate world for 3 years as a management consultant. Not everybody knows that. And then in November 2011, I took the big leap and decided to go pursue my music full time. So I've been self-employed now, doing my thing for the past 11 years.
You have a background in so many different things, but you also decided to step into the arena, right? And actually speak for truth. Mm. What led you to want to do that?
That's a great question. So I started to I've always paid attention to what's going on in the world. But in 2014, 2015, I particularly started to notice a shift happening, especially in the West, especially in the Anglosphere, UK, USA, Canada, Australia. And I started to see, I was really seeing the rise of what people now call woke culture, or various aspects of that. It could be the racial conversation, the gender conversation, the trans conversation. All of this stuff just really started bubbling up more, and I started paying more attention to it. And I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time. I remember early on, I guess was it 2016, when Jordan Peterson in Canada was speaking out against Bill C-16 and so on. So I was paying attention to all of that stuff that was happening. And actually for me, the moment that was the tipping point, because I've been very active on social media for well over a decade. I've been on Facebook since 2004, been on Twitter since 2009, YouTube since 2007, something like that, although I wasn't super active on it. And I used to, especially as a musician, as a professional musician, I would sometimes, I'd always put my ideas in my music, but in terms of social media and general public conversation, I never really wanted to talk about politics or potentially controversial or polarizing social issues, cultural issues, that kind of stuff. I was just like, nah, there's not much to gain from it. I also don't want to distract from my music. I want the focus to be on my music. That's how my mindset always was. And then in 2018, things reached a point where I felt very compelled to speak out. I had a lot of stuff to say, and I wasn't seeing a lot of people saying what I was thinking. One thing that's interesting now when I travel around and I meet people around the world is so many people say, man, you say so many things that I'm thinking, but perhaps can't verbalize or articulate. And so there was a tipping point where the reins just came off, and I was like, okay, this is it. And what actually happened, I'll tell you the story, is there was, I won't name any names, but there was a guy I know who I'd been friends with on Facebook for a while, met him in person, and he was the student union president of a university in the UK.
At Oxford, where you were?
No, not at Oxford, in a different university. I don't want to identify him, so I won't go too specific. And he was, social justice warrior type, super lefty, always, every single day on his Facebook, just talking all the woke nonsense. And typically I just ignore it or whatever. But he said something along the lines of, it was something to do with the University Debate Society. And he said something about, it was the I support free speech, but thing. So he was like, I support free speech, but people shouldn't be allowed to say things that are hateful and offensive. We welcoming diverse viewpoints, but not things that spread hatred. Or it was that kind of weird, mealy-mouthed, vague wording. And I felt compelled to reply to this because I know what someone like this considers "quote unquote" hate speech is anything remotely conservative or anything. So I was like,
anything they disagree with.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is a student union president. This isn't a nobody. This is someone who's in a powerful position at a well-known British university. So I just replied. This is on Facebook. So I just replied and said, what do you mean by you support, like who decides what's "quote unquote" offensive, who decides what's those are very subjective terms, and you can't say you support free speech and open debate, but those things. And we got into this back and forth on Facebook. And anyway, long story short, he was trying to bring a lot of his friends into it because this is all happening on his page, and he's trying to bring all these other people into the conversation, and everyone ends up siding with me, which was quite funny. So I think that kind of annoyed him because I don't even know these people. These are his friends. And they're like, yeah, the Zuby guy's making a good point. And anyway, the conversation ended by him saying, "quote unquote, people like Zuby are harmful and have dangerous ideas which get people killed. People like him should not be allowed on university campuses."
Wow.
And I was like, oh, that's where this has gone. This has gotten to a level where someone like myself with very moderate, reasonable, normal, like this person doesn't even think I should be allowed on a university campus. He's talking about me like I'm some kind of hate monger who's, by the way, in this conversation, I didn't even share my own views, right? He just knows that I'm a bit more conservative, and he's there saying I should be banned from universities. And I'm like, okay, when I was in university, it wasn't like this. So after seeing all the crazy stuff happening, I'd seen, when they were burning down universities over Ben Shapiro coming and the stuff with Jordan Peterson. And I was just like, man, this stuff is not just happening in Canada, US. This idea pathogen is spreading to my own country and it's going everywhere. So that for me was like my radicalization moment where where I was just
I don't
like,
consider
okay,
you radical, but I know what you mean.
but I was like, yeah, if people like myself
Yeah.
can be considered radical to the point that I shouldn't even be allowed to speak at a university, this thing's jumped the shark. It's gone way too far, and I need to join this conversation. So from that point, especially on Twitter, this is again around, I want to say August, September 2018, I just started to be more vocal. Oh, by the way, of course, at this point, Brexit has happened. Trump's been voted in. I've seen people going off the hinges on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm just feeling, okay, there's just a lot of weird stuff going on. These people are calling everyone Nazis and far right, and everyone's here as commies. And I'm just like, man, this is weird. We need some adults in the room. So I just started sharing my thoughts more. At that point, across all my social media combined, I had 50,000 followers. This is after a decade plus. I had 18,000 on Twitter. And February 26th, of course, is when I posted my infamous deadlift tweet where I said I identified as a woman and broke the British women's deadlift record. And that was like an atom bomb. That just blew up, went insane, led to millions of people discovering me.
And what kind of response did you get for that? You said that you identify now as a woman for a day.
Just a few seconds.
Or for a few seconds.
Yeah.
And that you decided to enter yourself into the competition of female deadlift. And then what kind of response did you get for that? Are you called like an anti-transgender or something?
Well, the thing is, the way I phrased it and the way it happened, it was very much a checkmate maneuver. Because to this day, keep in mind, this is February 2019, more than 3.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And the people pushing this ideology, if you ask them what a woman is, what do they say? They always have the same answer.
There's no answer, right?
No, either they won't answer or they'll say anyone who identifies as a woman.
Right.
Right? So I took this logic 3.5 years ago and I just said, okay, well, I identify as a woman. So either, according to your logic, either I am the British women's deadlift record holder or I'm not actually a woman. Pick one. There's no other way. One of the two. Right? So if you're going to go with your ideology, cool, thank you, give me the record. If not, then this is blown, far beyond Matt Walsh's documentary or whatever, which proved this further. This has blown an entire hole in this whole argument that anyone who simply identifies as a woman is a woman. It's just showing, okay, this is the fundamental. There's a lot of problems with that idea, but let me show you why this is so silly. And the thing that inspired me to do that was seeing actual situations of males beating females in their sports. It was happening in colleges here in this country. It had happened in MMA. It had happened in a few different sports. It wasn't as big an issue and conversation as it is now. And I think that's one reason why it went so crazy, because the Olympics was also supposed to be coming up. So this was in the zeitgeist as a conversation, and it was a hot button issue. But the feedback was incredibly positive, incredibly positive.
People are with you.
Oh, people, absolutely. Absolutely. 99% positive. And even the ones who are negative, I mean, there's some people who were half got it and were angry at me because they're like, you're not really a woman. What you did was unfair to women. I'm like, you kind of get it, but you're also,
right. I mean,
it's also got over.
Like you're saying, there are real examples of women competing against men. I mean, one of the examples I give to moms that talk about this, transgender advocacy stuff is, imagine you had a daughter. Every single day she wakes up at 4:30 in the morning to practice for swimming. And every single day she just trains and trains and trains. And one day she wakes up and she actually has to swim against a man. What kind of chance does she have? Right? And so the example that you gave is really kind of symbolic of a greater problem that our society just 4 years later has completely normalized.
Yeah. Well, it's not, they don't need to imagine that because it's happening.
Correct.
This is a real thing. I have friends who have daughters who have had to compete against boys.
Yeah.
It's not a joke. It's a very real thing. If it continues down this line, it will be the end of women's sports. Beyond that, it will be the end of women as we know it. The entire thing's incredibly misogynistic. Like, we live in a society that likes to talk about sexism and I mean, you want to talk about sexism and misogyny? How about trying to erase half of the people on Earth and just say that, oh, any dude, any man can be that? I mean, I don't think there's anything more misogynistic than the trans movement.
No, I completely agree. I mean, on top of that, where are the feminists? Where are the feminist moms?
They're there. I'll be real. They're there.
Yeah.
They are actually there. A lot of them have been deplatformed from social media because of this, the so-called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. And they face a lot of backlash. You see a lot of backlash. I mean, there are more sort of OG type, old school type feminists who are completely opposed to this. They call them gender critical feminists. There's a lot of them out there, but they've been pushed to the margins and they get attacked literally, physically by men in most cases. The whole thing has just become I wouldn't even call it a men's rights movement. It's like a confused men's rights movement. And this is one issue where, like, I'm not a fan of feminism in general, but this is one where I'm like, man, I will stand with feminists 100% on this issue, because women should be able to have their own spaces and their own sports and their own this, and you shouldn't just be having dudes coming in here and taking it all over. Like, it's just wrong. It's fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we're also sold that as women we should try to behave like men, and we should, just be this. I've always said men and women are equal, but it doesn't mean that we're the same.
No.
Right. And so I agree with you about, where are the old school feminists who actually cared about women and actually cared about these issues. But a bigger question I have for you is what is happening to our men in our society? My interpretation of what I'm seeing is that men are becoming squishy. They're demasculated. But also, it's almost they're confused. They've become softer. They don't have that much courage to fight. They're seeing things that they don't like, but they're whispering about it. They're not actually coming out and protecting their daughters or their sons or their country or their community, and they're just kind of fearful. And are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, for many years. For many, many years. It's all connected. It's all interconnected. One big problem that's happening right now in the West is there are so many contradictory and conflicting ideas and messaging that you're supposed to believe simultaneously, despite the fact that many of them cancel each other out. So simultaneously, we're all supposed to believe that men and women are exactly the same, but also very different, to the point that, there's the patriarchy and women are oppressed and so on. Oh, and also, they don't really exist. Like, men and women are not actually distinct categories. There's not really such a thing as a man or a woman. Like, everyone's actually gender neutral, and babies are just gender neutral, and everything is a social construct. Doesn't make sense, right? You can't believe all that simultaneously. Men, specifically, are also hit. Young men are hit with a lot of confusing messaging. Masculinity is toxic. There's something fundamentally wrong with boys being boys or men being men. Boys are kind of defective girls, and you should just not have all that energy and competition and sit down and shut up and so on. Also, we don't really need men. Women don't need men. There's a questions literally, like, are men even necessary? Do we even need that whole? And then at the same time, it's like, where have all the real men gone? There's an absence of masculinity. What happened to chivalry? But also don't hold the door open because that's sexist. So I think a lot of young men, particularly here in the West, are just confused. Like, they're hit with so much confusing messaging, telling them on one hand to step up and be more masculine and take care of society and fight. And so, but then also being told, no, don't do that. Sit down and shut up and make space for girls, make space for women. You're an oppressor. You're responsible for this and that. You're part of the patriarchy. You're also, maybe you're even a potential rapist. All men are potential. And so I think a lot of young men are just like, wait, like what do I do? And I think you combine that with the fact that now, I mean, if you look, especially under the age of 30, there's all this nonsense about gender pay gap. I mean, in a lot of big cities in the West now, under the age of 30, women overall on average out-earn men. Women are getting the majority of the degrees. Women are doing better in school. So I think one issue that we have as well is that so many people view everything as zero sum. Society views things as zero sum. And I think people need to understand that you can uplift one demographic without pulling down another. So I think for the past several decades, there's been so much focus on feminism and raising up women and so on and giving opportunities. And I'm not saying that's something that's inherently bad, but it's also been, but we also need to tear down men. It's a little bit like when it comes to certain racial conversations, it's like, okay, we want to uplift Black people, so we need to tear down white people. We need to lift up this group, so we need to tear down that group. And it's like, no, you can uplift people without tearing down the other side. So in answer to your question, I think a culmination of all those different factors together, and then I guess you can couple that with declining testosterone levels, which is happening due to lifestyle, due to diet, due to sedentary lifestyles, due to certain toxins, phthalates, things like that. I mean, male testosterone levels are plummeting, and that's a big problem that a lot of people don't talk about, and that's leading to fertility problems and so on. But I think all those things coupled together lead to the phenomenon that you're now discovering. So I think there's millions and millions of young men, especially out there, who are confused. They're trapped between this sort of traditional version of masculinity and society's expectations, but then this new age, you are just supposed to be soft and mushy and super in touch with your feminines. In fact, maybe you're actually a woman. Like, that's confusing messaging. If you're not someone who has been raised in a very solid way and had good positive masculine role models out there to see, I can totally understand how an 18-year-old or 22-year-old or whatever is just like, man, like, what am I even supposed to do as a man? What's my role in society as a man? I don't need to go out and fight in a war anymore. I don't really need to, be a warrior. I don't even need to be a breadwinner per se.
Or a protector.
Yeah, I don't need to be a protector. But also, those are still things that are attractive to women because biology remains biology as much as people might try to socially engineer it. And I think it's just confusing. I think young women are hit with a lot of confusing messaging as well. But I think that some of it overlaps. But I think the confused and mixed messaging to each sex is a little bit different. And I think that's what's happening on the male end.
I think the war on boys starts at such an early age. If you actually look, so I taught every grade in California, kinder through 7th grade. And you notice that even within the setup of the schools, there is this expectation that boys will behave more like girls. Anything from in kinder, 1st, 2nd grade, there's such a strong emphasis on the fine motor skills versus allowing boys to be who they need to be. And then there is, very severe punishment on boys that behave physical or kind of a little rambunctious, which is the nature of a boy and many times, but the schools will suppress that. I mean, I constantly hear about parents who their kids are being expelled from school because they had some kerfuffle with another boy. This continuous punishment of boxing boys into behaving against their own nature, I think also has long-term ramifications as well. They just don't know how to channel their masculine energy.
Yes.
And then on top of that, the vast majority of educators and it just kind of happens naturally, are women. And so I think it's really important that men do step in, whether they're coaches or we just need to bring more male influence onto our boys and allow them to channel their masculinity in a healthy way versus in a way that is continuously punishing them and trying to like kind of push them towards being more like feminine. Right.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of really obvious stuff that our society has just got some type of cultural amnesia about. And there are certain truths that are uncomfortable, so people act like they're not. And there's, as we both said, look, men and women, males and females are different. And that's not just okay, that's good. I think that's something that we need to remember, right? It's not just when you say that people get all weirded out when you talk about any type of gender differences or whatever. And it's like, dude, like that's fine. It's also not saying every single man is like this and every single woman is like that. We're saying, look, there are differences. There's a lot of overlap. We are the same species, but these differences do matter and they manifest in various ways. And some stuff is very obvious. I mean, if you're a woman, you have, despite all the nonsense that's happening these days, you haven't been a male for one day in your life. Right? You've never been a boy before. So as much as you can try to empathize and sympathize and understand, you're never going to totally know what it's like, right? I've been a male my entire life. Since I was in my mother's womb, I've never been a girl. I'm never going to be an actual woman. I can do my best to empathize and sympathize, but if my niece is going through, I can understand it from a male perspective, and I might even be able to give some insight in another way, but I'm like, I've never been a woman. There are certain things that women go through that only other women can understand. There's certain things males go through. So when it comes to that situation, I don't think there's not inherently a problem with majority of teachers being female or anything like that. But I think when you couple that with the fact that a lot of those boys may not even have a father at home or other positive masculine role models, and they're only getting that's why, I mean, I don't even think you can blame the women for that almost over coddling, because they're treating the boy as they understand it from the female perspective. And women, as we know, tend to be more nurturing, have more concerns about the physical safety of their boys. So on, like as a man, I have quite a different perspective on it, right? I have a fairly controversial view out here, actually. I think that it's good for little boys to have some fights. I think that's good, right? I think it's better. If you're going to fight, it's better to get into a fight when you're 7 years old or when you're 12 years old or when you're 15 years old than when you're 25, when you're 35, when you're 40, when the stakes are much, much higher. You could get killed. You could kill somebody. Like if I get into a fight now as a grown man, that's very serious. I wouldn't get into a fight unless this is something, it's ultra serious. There's no other way out of it because the consequences are so high. I could kill somebody. Somebody could kill me. I could end up in prison. I could go, it's not a joke. When I was in boarding school and I was 13 or I was 11 and you get into a little scrap with another, no one really gets hurt. You're not strong enough physically to cause a lot of damage unless someone uses a weapon or something. Yeah, you should, it's not right. It's not good, but you learn from it. You learn from it. And I think it's much better to learn those lessons early. And I've said this to some people before. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. I'll be real. I don't think, I don't know. I have concerns for if a man's a grown adult and has never once been in any physical fight. I don't actually think that's a good thing.
If you had a son around 10 years old and another kid picked a fight on him, what would you tell him to do?
Defend himself. I always defended myself. I've never started a fight before, but I finished a few.
So it's so interesting because so much of the school system now is saying, well, if somebody picks up a fight on you, you should just go tell on them or whatever. But
and again, I think that's the wrong message. I don't even think it comes from a bad place. I just think it comes from a misunderstanding, and I would say an overly feminine view of those things, because that's not how. I don't want anyone to think I think the only way to solve a conflict is through violence or anything. Far from it. But I think the key thing that's important to learn, something every man I think fundamentally inherently knows if he's been socialized well and really lived life, is unfortunately but it's just the way of the world. Violence is the final way of settling things. There's only 3 ways to solve any conflict. Okay? There is discussion and debate, conversation. Huge fan of it. Part of why I'm a free speech advocate. Doesn't matter if you're talking about between individuals, between groups, between nations, conversation, discussion, diplomacy, negotiation. Number 1. Number 2, separation, segregation, divorce. You go that way, we go that way. We don't even interact. That's how we resolve the conflict. Number 3, physical violence. That's all. Those are the only 3 ways to solve a solution. So I think it's important for a young man to understand that that's the bottom baseline, right? So you should always, it's important to learn how to communicate and how to negotiate and how to be diplomatic and so on, right? It's important to learn when to just distance yourself, walk away. But it's important to understand there are situations where there is no other way out of this situation than some type of physical conflict. And as I said, I think it's much better. I think it's much safer, actually, much safer to learn that young than to learn it old, right? There's situations where I've seen where people put themselves in very, very dangerous situations because I don't think they even realize that physical confrontation is even a possibility, right? You've probably seen, I don't know.
Or they're like oblivious.
Yeah, when you see these situations of, I don't know, some guy who, I don't know, he wants to get into a club or something and the bouncer doesn't want to let him in and he's getting all like rowdy and like, bro, you're going to fight, you're going to get your butt kicked.
You're saying that if they're coddled their entire lives, they don't build the instinct that it could lead into that direction.
Exactly. And as a result, they can end up putting themselves and putting other people in dangerous situations. If you understand, I mean, I'm not a MMA fighter or a boxer or anything like that. But if you talk to people who have done very high level martial arts and who really deeply, if you talk to fighters who really understand the reality of violence, like they've been punched in the face, they've been knocked out, they've knocked people out, they've choked people out. Those guys know to avoid violence because they
true.
Right? They know those are the guys who are least likely to get you in trouble or to get in trouble because they're like, no, it's real. This is not.
Yeah.
This isn't a joke. This is not just a video game or a movie or something. Violence is very serious and it has real consequences. So let's do everything possible to. Those are some of the most peaceful people because they get it. And I think when people kind of put themselves in those situations or put others in that, it's because they're living in this kind of dreamland where they don't think like, oh, that'll never happen. By the way, I think this is part of why, this year, this horrible thing has broken out with Ukraine and Russia. And I think one reason why it's had such an impact on all these other countries that are actually disconnected from it is because it's reminded people that that's possible. I think in the West, for the past several decades, fortunately, across our own countries, it's been remarkably peaceful. Yes, there's been foreign conflicts, but I think this reminded people, oh, whoa, like war is still a possibility.
Right.
I think people have almost forgotten. We've had so many decades of peace, people have forgotten, oh, that can even happen. That can even happen near us. And I think it made people go, oh, and that's why it sort of spooked people and woke them up out of this stupor and went, whoa, like, I thought we were past that. I thought that was just what happened in history. You look at history, war, fighting, battles, invasions, nonstop, millions and millions and millions of people killed, people fighting all the time. And we've had this relative era of peace, which is wonderful. But as you alluded to earlier, both on an individual level and a societal level, that can breed a level of complacency and a disconnection from some of the realities of the world and the idea that even something like staying physically fit and healthy is not even important because like, well, what do I need to be in shape for?
Right.
It's like, because you're not even thinking, okay, maybe I need to be battle ready. Maybe I need to be prepared for something. In the past, it was like, yeah, of course you've got to be battle ready.
Right.
Whereas now it's like,
how dare you be battle ready, right?
Yeah, the U.S. military is having problems because I don't believe the majority of men are even in shape they don't even meet the minimum physical fitness standard, which are not super high, by the way. But they don't even reach the minimum physical fitness standards. And, we can act like that's not a problem. But that's not a good thing.
No, it's for sure a problem. I like to think of history, for those who even learn history, right? It starts with wars. It's like a clock, right? So at 12 o'clock, it starts with the wars. And then at 3 o'clock, you recover from the war. And then at 6 o'clock, you're kind of like getting into like this great life where, there's still the experience and the learning and the recovery from the war. By the time you get to 9 o'clock, you can't even remember everything you've learned from the wartime. And so everything is just like, wonderful and Care Bears, and there's never going to be violence. And that complacency ultimately leads to that 12 o'clock again and the wars again. And it just goes around and around and time again. And so it is so dangerous. And it does feel like we've kind of like made it into this, 9 o'clock zone where we're just like unaware of how important it is to have, self-reliance and responsibility. And, the world has been created with men and women. And, there is a role for the woman and there is a role for a man. And when we create this complete societal chaos, this is part of the way to reach back into that 12 o'clock, war zone, whether it's a physical war zone or it's just a mental war zone, and certainly a war both on females and on males within our own society. So I know these things take incredible courage to speak about, but it's just such common sense that it's bizarre that people say. I'm sure people come to you all the time and say, how do you have the courage to speak about absolute common sense that everybody, should already know and is probably thinking, but don't have the courage to say. So I'm wondering, where do you get your courage from?
God. Yeah, I only fear God.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's it. I don't say that lightly, but I think if you truly fear God, then fear of man, I'd rather be canceled by man than canceled by God. So it's not hard for me. It's hard for me not to. It's hard for me not to speak up and talk about these issues because I think it's necessary and it's what's on my mind, and I cannot sleep well at night if I don't speak what I believe to be true, or if I hide away from the world, or if I feel like I'm being a coward or anything like that. That's all it is for me.
What is your answer to people who, especially in the culture or in academia, which you come from both of those worlds, right? You went to Oxford, it's as academic as it gets, and then, you're fully in the culture. What is your answer to people who say, well, God is made up, we have our own hearts to follow, God and religion has created wars. Like, we hear these things here at PragerU all the time when people come after us and say, God is a thing of the past.
Well, that's a book right there.
Right.
That's a book right there. I mean, if someone doesn't even believe in that concept and has a completely atheistic worldview, then I guess the truth is they will need to find their courage elsewhere if that's the conclusion that they've drawn. In terms of the war aspect, I think the honest answer is that human beings start and fight in wars. Have some of those supposedly been in the name of religion? Absolutely. But primarily, if you want to be honest about wars, most wars are fought over resources. Wars tend to be, sometimes ideology is used to justify or find some type of excuse for them, whether it's a religious or a non-religious ideology, but it's typically over land, resources, oil, gold,
power, government power.
Yeah, that's really what the majority of conflicts are about. So I think it's a bit disingenuous when people say, religion causes wars. It's like, people are going to fight. I mean, look at the 20th century. Look at the 20th century, which was one of the most brutal in human history. Was that over religion? If you look at Nazism, you look at various incarnations of communism, Maoism, Stalinism, whatever. Those were all secular states, explicitly.
Absolutely.
Right? It was one of the most fundamental ideas in Christianity is that human beings have a sinful nature, right? We're fallen creatures. We're prone to sin. We're prone to conflict and violence and various issues. And I think actually if you understand that and religion teaches that, then I don't think you don't make those kind of statements because you see that the problem is within the human heart. And it always will be. It doesn't have to even come to war. I mean, if you just talk about crime, violent crime and people doing and saying things that are wrong, it's just part of the human condition. And sadly, unless you were to get rid of human beings, you're not going to be able to get rid of all of it. I think we can create societies and cultures and nations that incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior and create an environment and opportunities and a culture where as many people as possible strive to do good and be good. And by the way, I think we've done very well with that. As much as we discuss some of the problems that are happening right now, I think it's so important for people to maintain perspective and gratitude and to remember that, yeah, okay, 2022, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. It can feel concerning. It can feel like, oh my gosh, this is the craziest time ever, but it's really not. It's really not. Like, please look at a history book and, even think about the life that your grandparents or your great-grandparents lived and think, would they probably happily trade with you? And the answer for virtually anyone, if they're being honest, is going to be yes, absolutely. I'd rather be in 2022 than 1922 or 1822 or 1722 and so on. So whilst we might be going through a small correction right now, and I do believe we've been overcorrecting in our societies for a while, I think kind of like a stock market, the general trend is upward. You're going to get recessions, you're going to get drops, but the overall trend for humanity improving and our societies improving and things becoming safer and healthier and life expectancy going up and childhood mortality going down and literacy going up and all of those things, overall liberty going up, I think those are long-term on an upward trajectory. So that's why with all the stuff I talk about and see, I'm always an optimist. Long-term, I'm always optimistic.
Well, the other thing that I think we can be optimistic about, and that is positive, is that I think more people are realizing that they want to walk with God and they want to bring God into their lives, and they don't want big government to be their God or the academia to be their God. While big government and the academia are trying to push against that, you're seeing more and more of the population finding independence and the will to really believe in God as opposed to believe in government. So I think that is, a very positive thing, obviously, as well.
Yeah, there is. It's just about finding a balance. And I think one reason why things have been tricky is because I think so much progress has genuinely been made in the last few decades that people haven't even sort of taken a breather to realize it. And so they're overcorrecting and going super far on all these issues without even looking up and going, wait, actually, hang on. Okay, let's look just at the USA. Think about the USA in 1922, right? Think about the way people treated people of different races, conflicts and unfair opportunities between men and women, the way certain groups were stigmatized, pushed to the side, this and that, laws on the books. 2019, people, the KKK were still riding around. That's not 100 years is one person's lifetime, right? So in one human being's lifetime, we've gone from that to where we are now. And so perhaps on some of these issues now, things are overcorrecting. Now it's like, oh, let's be racist against white people. Oh, let's put the boot down on men. Oh, let's,
that
Pride,
clock.
Yeah, let's have a Pride Month for every month of the year, right? They've overcorrected on the stuff. And I think that's happened because people haven't looked up and gone, actually, you know what? For the first time, in the first place in human history, we've largely achieved, certainly under the law, we've essentially achieved equality. Right? You will, if someone disagrees with me, like point me to some laws that are
always be racist and anti-Semites and people who do bad things and people who Again, hurt women, etc.
That's
we're not inherently perfect.
Yes, that's part of the human heart. But the question, I think, a great way to gauge where a society is actually what's tolerated, right? So I don't think people like to point out that there are still racist people. Oh, there's racist people in the UK. Oh, there's racist people in the US. I'm like, okay, well, firstly, what percentage of the population, right? People run around screaming about white supremacy. What percentage of the population hold actual white supremacist views? And are those views tolerated? You used to have white supremacists in freaking Congress. You used to have governors of states here in the USA who were open segregationists, advocates of white supremacy. This is not that long ago, right? Can you imagine, whether Democrat or Republican, can you imagine someone running on an actual white supremacist platform now?
Right, there's no greater insult than that.
They would be hammered by both, even the most conservative person out there would be,
disassociation all around.
Completely. Yeah. Whereas those people used to just be in these high positions. You used to have police chiefs and people who just held these views. It was like an accepted position, right? It used to be, oh yeah, like, half the people are pro-segregation, half the people are whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not, and the thing is, I think when people look at the history, they're almost looking at it in the wrong way. They're like, oh, well, so see, that's evidence that the USA is a racist country. And it's like, well, first of all, those views were pretty global. Like around the world, if you've traveled, you'll and some history, you'll know please find me a sinless country, right? Every country has had dark, bad stuff in its history.
In many countries, not even in its history, even currently,
yes.
Right
Things are still happening right now, right? There's still stuff that are, in law and in policies and stuff that's very bad, but is tolerated and so on. And so, to me, when I look at American history and I even look at that story, I don't view that as a reason to condemn the country and its people right now. I think like, whoa, look at the progress that's been made. Go back 150 years ago. Again, and I think it's good to think of 150 years as two people, 2 lifetimes.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Because it makes it sound more reasonable. If you say 150 years, it sounds like, oh, that's a long, long time ago. But I'm like, bro, that's 2 people.
Yeah, it's a
2
lot of
people's
progress.
lifetimes. You look at the progress that's been made, and how can you look at that and be like, oh, well, nothing's changed. It's exactly, I'm like, dude, stop, right? You want to live in 1850? Like, this conversation would not be legal.
True.
We could be arrested for this conversation. Isn't that crazy?
That's crazy.
Right?
Yeah,
like,
it's crazy.
Oh, I want to go to a restaurant. Like, sorry,
Yeah.
bro, you can't be in this restaurant. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, you walked in the wrong, like, that's not, so yeah, that was bad, and it's good for people to know that history, but don't dwell on it and bring it into the present as if that's how things still are, and as if that's how people still are, or if that's what people are advocating or wanting to go back to, because that's not reality. So I think you have people who never even experienced, and also, by the way, I think it's I actually think it's quite disrespectful to people of the past who endured certain things to act as if it's all the same right now.
Right,
And
we're cheapening their experience.
Like you're going through the same thing, right? I think it's kind of the reason why, for example, like, Jewish people don't like things being compared to the Holocaust that aren't that serious, because it's like you're kind of cheapening the
or apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, you're cheapening the experience of something that was genuinely dreadful and horrific. And if you're just going to like flippantly call, oh, well, everything is like that,
Right.
It's like, well, no, it's not. You can say that something is bad without comparing it to something that was truly, truly awful. But yeah, I think that's where we are now. And I think that, by the way, I also think we've passed peak woke. I think the pendulum is, I don't think we've reached peak stupidity, but I think the tolerance, I think the tolerance and acceptance, implicitly and explicitly, of a lot of really, really bad cultural ideas has passed its peak. As you alluded to earlier, more people are starting to, number one, be aware of it, but also push back, right? You're seeing parents didn't know what their kids were learning in school. They didn't see all this. I think there's been this awakening of like, wait, hang on, what's going on? No, we don't want this, we don't want that. And I think it's going to come back towards a happy, balanced medium.
Well, I think for a lot of people, a lot of this craziness that has been happening, where it's woke stuff or crazy ideas, didn't feel so close to home until it started targeting our children. You see, the rise of the mama bears, or the parents in general, where once upon a time it was like, okay, well, this stuff is happening maybe in Hollywood, maybe in government, maybe outside of my home, but now you're attacking my actual child. Now I'm awake. Now I'm paying attention. I think that's a big part of it, is that they've so overstepped into the wrong arena that people are going to have to wake up, because it is the natural instinct of a parent to protect their children, and it should be the natural instinct of a parent to fight against the PC culture and whatever is unpopular and say, well, no, you're not going to be, driving this crazy stuff into my own home, into my own children's brains.
Yes.
Which, speaking of that, can I challenge you a little bit about an era that I find to be somewhat regressive, and that is music. Okay. So you're obviously a rapper. I find that rap is actually harmful I don't allow my kids to listen to rap. And
Not even Zuby?
Well, Zuby is different. Okay, Zuby is different. But you know where I'm headed here, right? It's like the language is so degrading towards women. It's profanity. And so much of it is anti-police. It's anti almost anything good. It's angry and aggressive oftentimes. And so I know that I might be living in a bubble because my kids are still somewhat young and they're not going to ask me what to listen to in probably a minute. But for now, I actually find that kids who are subject to this kind of music, whether the parents are driving the car or whether it's at a party, I actually find that these kids ultimately behave poorly, oftentimes, really have a hard time understanding, how to deal with authority. And again, the language, like you don't want little children using that kind of language. So what is your reaction to that? What are your thoughts when it comes to rap?
Yeah, that's a huge question. That's a huge question. And obviously I'm a professional rapper.
Yeah.
And have been for many years at this point. So I think that I love hip hop, obviously. I love rap music, and I've been a fan of it for over 2 decades. And I've been listening to stuff I probably shouldn't have listened to from, 11 or 12 years old.
I guess it didn't mess you up.
I don't even cuss.
Right. But you're
by the way, when
every
I was in
time.
boarding school, that was one thing that really confused my housemaster, because I used to play music far louder than I should, and everyone used to be able to hear it like throughout the house. And my housemaster was like, Zuby, how do you listen to this music and you don't even swear?
Yeah.
How is that even possible? And I think actually the answer to that is important. And I think the true answer is because I was raised very well and I have great parents and I come from a great family and I can separate entertainment from reality. So I'm not negatively influenced by whether it's video games or it's music or it's movies or whatever. None of that stuff can ever affect my behavior. If I go and later today I watch some crazy movie or I go and play Grand Theft Auto or whatever, and I'm running people over in cars and shooting people in the game or whatever, and I'm seeing that on the screen, it doesn't affect me in a negative way. And I think that's important because there are millions and millions of people out there who were, especially in my age group, who were raised on, I'm from the age of South Park and Grand Theft Auto and Eminem and all these things, Dr. Dre, 50 Cent, and all my friends listened to or whatever. We all came out totally fine. But again, we typically have in common that we were raised well and that we had good parents. We weren't looking to those people looking to those lyrics or that entertainment as a guideline on how to live our life or what's acceptable behavior or not. It was purely in the entertainment realm. So I think that's a really important factor. I would say that if a child's primary role model is a gangster rapper or even a musician in general, pop musician even, I think there's I think we need to go back and there's a problem that's already occurred because a child's role models should not be entertainers, first of all. When it comes to the actual criticisms of the content itself, that's also a pretty nuanced position. So I share a lot of it. A very well-known rapper got murdered, Takeoff from the Migos, and he was 28. PNB Rock, another well-known rapper, got murdered here in LA just a couple of weeks ago. There's been so many. Pop Smoke also got murdered here in LA, in Hollywood. 2 years ago, he was 21, I think. So my entire life, there's been rappers are the only genre of music where like there's a high risk of getting murdered. And people don't like to talk about that, especially fans of the music, fans of the culture. You can go way back to the 90s, Biggie, Tupac, right? Like there's been so many high profile murders of rappers. And, then you can expand this out to the general problem that's happening with a lot of young black men, particularly in inner cities who are involved in gang stuff. And people are uncomfortable to even talk about it honestly. I think that non-black people are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to be, seen as being quote unquote racist or something like that. I think that a lot of black people are concerned about talking about it, especially hip hop and rap fans, because number one, they want to defend the music and the culture. And also they people just want to shy away from it from a whole bunch of reasons. Obviously the industry doesn't want to talk about it because the truth is that they profit from young black men talking about murdering each other. And sometimes that actually playing out in real life. That's the sick truth, is that there's a lot of money at stake there. There's a lot of reputation at stake. So people generally shy away from it all, and they don't really want to talk about all of that. Now, man, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. There's so many angles I could approach this from. Number one is, the reason my content is what it is, and the reason I rap about the things I do, is because I want to some small degree, counteract that and provide an alternative version of this. By the way, my parents had, prior to me becoming a rapper, they had very similar views.
They're old school like me.
On hip hop too. Yeah, yeah. And I get where it comes from, because I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from the mainstream. All right. So actually someone responded to me on Twitter and said something like 90% of rap promotes violence and degeneracy. And I said, that's not true. Maybe 90% of the rap you hear on the radio.
Well, that would be what I would say.
And in the nightclub and on major playlists, right? That's not even 1% of the music that's out there. So think about, why is that what's promoted? There's a lot of, comes back to profit, comes back to money. I mean, if you want to think more, if you think that it's more malicious, and it might be, one could say that there is someone's putting out some type of agenda over the past several decades to intentionally promote that type of content, whether it's the sexually explicit stuff, or it's the very profane stuff, or it's the violent stuff, or it's the stuff promoting drugs. Because there's tons of hip hop music out there. There's tons of rappers out there who don't talk about that, who don't promote as well. But you know what? They're not anywhere near as famous. Right. Right? I'm nowhere near as famous as some of these rappers.
Do you think that has worked against you?
I do, yeah. I do. I think if I were to embrace, I think from early on, I were to embrace a lot of the degenerate messaging and promote that and push that and whatever. Yeah, I do think that my career could and would go further. But that's not something I'm willing to do. And there's artists out there who have done very well, who don't promote degeneracy, but it's certainly not balanced. Right. It's certainly not balanced. I think another interesting consideration is, there's what the industry pushes. I think another interesting question is, why do people like it so much?
It is a good question.
Who's buying it? Yeah. Who's streaming it? Right? Well, so there's the demand, there's the supply side. But what about the demand side? By the way, I think the same with why do people like, why is Grand Theft Auto one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time? Why do people watch Saw movies, right? How many Saw movies are there? Like 6 or 7? Like
people are drawn to violence.
Why do people love gangster films? Very violent gangster films. They're cussing at each other, shooting people all the time. There is something in the human psyche, particularly the male psyche, that is drawn to that. That's drawn to sexually explicit content. That's drawn to violent content. That's drawn to, perhaps it could be a form of escapism. I do have a theory on this, by the way. Yeah. If we've got time to explain it.
Like a numbing mechanism.
Do you know what I think it is? And this comes back to our earlier conversation. I think that particularly when it comes to men, and by the way, all these things are primarily consumed by men. I think that biologically, we have this natural wiring. We have something in our body called testosterone. Yeah. Right? So we have a natural wiring towards aggression, potential violence. Obviously, we're wired for reproduction. I don't think the sexual content aspect is hard to understand why people are drawn to. And I think that because we live in such a peaceful and comfortable and happy time in society, and there's certain good boundaries and things that you can't act out, I think there's this level of satisfying those kind of desires and cravings in a way that's non-destructive. Right. You see what I mean?
So the alternative.
So when someone's driving around in their car and they're listening to some, hardcore gangster rap, or they're in the gym and they're training and they're listening to that, or they're there playing their video game where they're running around shooting monsters or shooting people or whatever, I think that's a way of getting some of that aggression and those
primal instinct.
Yes, that primal urge out there, and almost having this slightly fantastical thing without actually doing anything that's bad or breaking any law or anything. So I think it's kind of like a pressure valve in some sense. I mean, they have studied a lot about if there is a link between violent music or violent video games or whatever and actual violent behaviors. And I think they've been looking at this since the 90s. And I don't believe they've ever found any real link between them. Right. Because I remember in the 90s especially, and in the thousands, people were like, we need to ban this music, or we need to stop this video game from coming out. People were freaked out.
Right.
Remember when Mortal Kombat came out? People were freaking out. Kids are going to be trying to, knock each other's heads off and rip each other's heart out. It was like, no kid played Mortal Kombat and then tried to pull the spinal cord out of his friend or anything. It's not. it didn't manifest in the way that I think think people feared. So there is certainly there can be an element of moral panic, but there are also real considerations and problems with what is glorified and normalized. And I think it's very important what young people consider cool.
Yeah.
And hip hop is incredibly powerful. I think of any genre of music, I think hip hop is the most influential in determining what is cool.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, and I think just as adults and as human beings, do I think entertainers have a responsibility for their content? Absolutely, I do. Right? I think anyone, you don't even have to be a musician. I think if you are an adult, especially if you're an adult of influence, whether or not you want to be, you are going to be a role model to some degree. If millions of people know who you are and are hearing you and are listening to you and seeing your actions, it's not about you choosing to be a role model. You're going to be to some extent. So yes, I do think there's that responsibility. I also think, as I said before, if your children's, I think as a parent, if your child is being more influenced by Snoop Dogg than by you, there's something that's gone wrong there. Then when it comes to the industry and the record labels and the radio station, I'd like them to think, okay, what are we're here on 1 second saying Black Lives Matter. 2 seconds later, we're playing a record which talks about murdering Black people. Maybe we have a responsibility in what we're putting out there. So I think that there's a responsibility on everyone who's involved. If you're a consumer, if you're going out and you're streaming or buying all of this music, you're funding the machine that's sending the signal saying, hey, this is popular. Let's make more of it. Right? It's like, we all know McDonald's is not is McDonald's the best food in the world?
No, but they're driven by profit.
Yes, exactly. So if you're there like, why is McDonald's so popular? It's like, actually, why are so many people eating it? Why do so many people like it? There's better food that's out there. But every time someone goes to McDonald's and buys from them, they're like, okay, cool. Like, let's build more restaurants. Let's make more of these. Let's make more. So I think people need to remember that what you buy feeds the machine. And I don't think people think of this very consciously.
Right.
But I think if you do, then you can make your small decisions as an individual consumer. And some of it does, just come down to what people demand.
Right. Oh my gosh, so much to unpack there. Well, first of all, the music industry is obviously driven by profit, and so they probably tap into this natural instinct that people want something disruptive and oftentimes something that destroys or is violent or has this kind of like alternative, I guess, imaginary world for some of these kids is possibly attractive and then therefore very profitable for people, and they're not necessarily thinking, are we going to ruin society with that? I think the idea that parents need to be their kids' primary role model is true. I also understand that it's sometimes difficult because once your child is 6th, 7th, 8th grade, they're not a little child anymore. And so much impacts them, right? Like the culture that you're living in and all of that. Yeah.
I think if you've done a good job up to that point.
Yeah. You got to do it by 6th grade.
Yeah.
You
I
really
think if you've done a good job up to it by that point, then no rapper or video game or movie is going to turn your kid into some savage.
Well, I mean, and that ties into this other issue that we're dealing with where parents think that they need to be their child's friend. I mean, you see these moms dressing up like teenagers, then like, oh, when I was in college, I used to smoke and I used to be so cool. And they actually listen to this kind of rap music because they want to appear cool as opposed to appear as their child's guide. And I talk about this all the time. Your job is not to be your child's friend. Your job is to be your child's parent and to be guidance to them and to give them both love and boundaries. But I think this idea of giving children boundaries has just gotten out, flew out the door a few years ago, where parents just want to feel like they're young forever and they're like they're teenagers. And so I completely agree with you that, parents need to step in and make sure that they give their children a North Star and give them values and boundaries and all those things. But it is also very difficult for many parents who the culture is just constantly working against them.
Yes.
And like, there are not enough artists like you who say, well, I realize that I have a large following and I have therefore a responsibility to actually preach what is good. Because so much of what you sing about, you rap about is preach, right? You're preaching. You kind of in so many ways have a ministry, right? It's like a ministry. You probably have a larger ministry than many churches. And so what kind of an impact you can have on these young people, I don't know that enough rappers think about that. I think they should, and I'd love it if the industry actually cared about it enough. And just wondering if you're saying that your clean rap has probably worked against you in some ways. You've decided to go independent, which I think is something really fascinating that is happening with musicians right now, where they're saying, I'm not going to sign up necessarily with a label. I don't need to have a king to make me famous. I'm going to go on my own. And tell me a little bit about that experience and what has that been like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's interesting that now being independent is seen as cool.
Yeah.
So I put out my first album in 2006. I've been doing music for way longer than a lot of people realize. I was still in university. And at that time, in 2006, being independent was, it was just called being unsigned, right? The assumption was everyone wants and needs a record deal, and you can't make it or impact anything unless you get signed to a label. It was kind of like either you're signed, it was two very different tiers of artists, signed artists, unsigned, whatever, who cares? Signed, okay, cool, like you've quote unquote made it. It was all about the record deal. In my first 1 or 2 years of music, I also bought into that, and I kind of wanted to be signed, or I thought that would be my route. But once I'd released my first album, Commercial Underground, independently, and had started promoting and selling that, which again, I was still in university at the time. I released that when I was 19. And that started to get some traction. And also, I'd seen other independent artists, particularly in the US. There were a lot of US artists who had sold tens of thousands of albums without being signed to a record deal. So that made me know it was possible. I can do this independently. And I was seeing other people having independent success. And I thought, oh, okay, cool, I can do this. I was selling several thousand CDs a year. Wasn't making a killing, but I was making a living. And I was able to keep myself afloat. And so I realized early, and then as I learned more about the industry as well, the music industry is very murky. Most people know very, very little about it. And the more you learn about it, the more you're put off. The more you're put off, the more you realize, both from a creative angle, from a business angle, from a financial angle, if you can own your masters and have full creative control and full business control of your operation and your merchandising and all this, yes, it may be difficult to reach as many millions of people. If you want to become the next Justin Timberlake or Rihanna or Eminem, you're not going to get to that level without having a major label backing behind you. That's just the reality. You're not going to be the next Justin Bieber independently. But you can be incredibly successful independently. And then, so when I started out, it was all CDs. Right? This is even before most people were downloading. And then in came in iTunes. No one knew what streaming was. And then in came in Spotify and Apple Music and all these things. So in the 16 years I've been doing music, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of shifts. There have been a lot of challenges. But the independent route is better. I mean, now, if I look at where I am now, both as an artist, but also just as an individual, I can just honestly, I feel like I'm one of the few people in the world who can genuinely just do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Like I'm not, there's so many people who think that there's some secret agency behind me, or there's some like secretly there's a record label or there's this or what. It's like, it's really just, it's me. It's me.
Yeah.
And I've now grown my audience to, 1 million plus. And so many people around the world are hearing and resonating with what I'm doing, and I'm able to maintain creative control, business control, whatever I want to do. I want to write a book. I want to make this song. I want to do this album.
Be in a movie.
I want to be in a movie. I don't need to, let me go check with my manager and my agent and my label and this and that. The more you get involved in all that, the more tied up you become.
Yeah.
The more tied up you become, and actually the less you have control over yourself, your name, your work, your music, all your creative endeavors, all your business. Once you have dozens and dozens of people in that mix, you're actually way more restricted. And this is part of why so many musicians and artists and people in actors and so on, they don't speak up on certain things. Let me tell people something. Everyone thinks that the entertainment industry is like ultra woke and super left. Super. It's not. It's not. People think, oh, every rapper, every singer, everyone, they're all raging leftists. It's not true. It's not true. They're just quiet.
They're scared.
There are so many people, rappers, DJs, singers, actors, whatever. There are so many who are more either just sane liberals or more conservative leaning or more libertarian or just more centrist, apolitical, whatever. It's just that, as you know, if they speak up on that, number one, there's people around them telling them not to. There's all these people around them telling them, no, like you can't talk about it. You're pro-life, you can't say that. You're a Christian, you can't say that. By deleting one side of the argument, they create this false perception as if, oh, it's all that way. Maybe certain people at the top of industries are, but most people are not. Rappers are capitalists. Of course, rappers are pro-First Amendment. Of course, they're pro-Second Amendment, right? Rap is actually fundamentally it's quiet, even though, yeah, some of the content, can be, but if you actually think about who these guys are, right, and their some of their fundamental values, like a lot of them are more conservative, libertarian. They're not super duper woke. And the same goes for lots of people out there, but I think there's this false perception and reality. And so, I have conversations with people and I receive DMs. I get a lot of DMs from people who are like, hey man, I'm quietly supporting you. Like, I love what you're saying, right? But,
what do you say to them?
Man, sometimes it can be frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I get frustrated. I'm like, I'm 110 pounds. If I have courage, you can have courage too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It can be frustrating. There's two things that are very, very common that I get when I just meet people or talk to people or receive. Number one is, thank you for your courage. Yeah. And number two is, you say what I kind of want to say. But a lot, both of them have this underlying tone of people thinking that they cannot say what they really want to say. They have certain thoughts or things that they support or don't support. But due to various pressures, whether they work for a corporation or they're a musician or they're an actor and they're in this agency or conglomerate or whatever, and they're not tolerant of their views, so they decide to suppress it and stay quiet. I understand it. I also think it's a big part of the problem.
Well, I also think that it will create a greater problem because eventually people blow up. They feel like they're censored and controlled and censored and controlled. And eventually they just blow up and then they say horrible things, right? And so you got to wonder if there was just less censorship, if people were not feeling so oppressed and so bottled up, if things could just be more normalized. But otherwise you just have like this two extremes, right? The people who censor and the people who just don't care anymore. And so they'll yell every nonsense that they can think of. And then the middle, who is actually more sensible and more calm, cool, and collected, is just quiet because they're afraid of the backlash.
People forget that most people are somewhere in the middle. Everything is a normal distribution curve, right? If you look at the American population, 70% of people are going to be, even politically, sociopolitically, they're going to be in that middle section, right? They've got some liberal views, they've got some conservative views, they're, right-leaning, left-leaning, centrist, right? Yeah, you might find, 15% of people are like, fully very, very conservative. 15% of people are very, very liberal, very left-leaning, they think about politics a lot. So there's this huge chunk in the middle that can be swayed or is just not engaged. It's just not really, I think that's most people. Most people are just like, look, I'm trying to live my life and take care of my family and, just pay my taxes and not be bothered, have decent protection. Like I'm not ACAB. I'm not, hardcore black the blue. Like, I think police are good. Like, police are necessary. I'm just kind of here. I'm not, thinking about all this stuff. I care about, I need the economy. I don't want inflation to go crazy. I want my community to be safe. That's actually the majority of people. regardless of where someone sits politically, I don't think it's healthy to like have a hatred of half the people in your nation.
Right.
Right? Like that's not healthy at all.
That's what our enemies want us to do. They want us to, fight amongst each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And look, there's always going to be some degree of social and cultural and political polarization. You've got 340 million people in this country. I think the fact there's only 2 political parties, by the way, is a big problem. It's actually a massive problem.
Well, that's a whole nother conversation.
It's actually a massive
time.
problem because it polarizes people more than is necessary. But yeah, I think that's an issue that I'm seeing, and it seems to still be rising. And again, politicians and the media exacerbate it by playing to it further, and it just becomes honestly, when I even see campaigns here, so much of it is just
attacking the other.
It's just attacking the other. I'm like, I don't even know what this person's views and policies are.
We just know who they don't like.
I just know that you're dunking that way. You're dunking that way, and I'm like, what are your policies? What are you promoting? What are you supporting?
Well, I would also add our guiding principle here at PragerU is to not serve the mob or serve any sort of political party. We serve God. And I think as long as we keep that as our guiding principle, we will do what's right.
Yes.
It can become very addicting to step into the whirlpool on social media and post whatever everybody else is posting, or make the most extreme commentary out there so people notice us. But that is not the way of serving God, right? The way of serving God is to stick to the truth and to our values, and know that if people learn truth, speak truth, understand values, ultimately they'll make the best decisions and we'll live in a better society. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? We want to live in a place that is good.
Absolutely.
At least as good as we can make it.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, we can have this conversation for many more hours. There are so many tangents that I'd love to go on, but you'll just have to come back to my office again and we'll chat again. Thanks. That was great. A great talk.